Okay, so this is the Bible study for Matthew 20, verses 17 through 28. And the text says, Now Jesus was going to Jerusalem, up to Jerusalem. On the way, he took the 12 aside and said to them, We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified. On the third day, he will be raised to life. Then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons, kneeling down, and asked a favor of him. What is it you want? He asked. She said, Grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom. You don't know what you are asking, Jesus said to them. Can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink? We can, they answered. Jesus said to them, You will indeed drink from my cup. But to sit at my right or my left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father. When the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. Jesus called them together and said, You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. All right. Well, that seems short and simple, but I think it's probably pretty profound, and if we reflect on it, it's going to take us a little deeper, I think. So remember that you can download a PDF copy of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive so that you can follow along with us and study as we study this text. So number one says, what did we talk about last week? In Matthew 21 through 16, the kingdom of heaven is like. So that was a key thought in Jesus's sort of telling a parable and explaining. He's trying to explain a truth of the kingdom of heaven. And not just tell a story. B, a landowner went out early in the morning to hire workers and agreed to pay them a denarius. That's true. C, he went out several other times and found workers not working and hired them as well. And D, he paid those hired last first, and he paid them a denarius. Which was the same as what he'd agreed with those who were hired first. Those hired first expected to get more, but they didn't. F, the landowner noted that he is able to do what he wants with his own money. He asked that in the form of a question, but there was an understood answer. And pointed out that they are envious because he is generous. He also asked that in the form of a question, but we all know that that is the reason they were upset. Which sounds really bad. So if you're the one that he's talking about, that sounds really bad. I'd rather say that he is being unfair. That sounds like a reasonable accusation against him, and the first idea sounds like I'm immature and selfish and an arrogant judge of the one in charge. And that is what Jesus was trying to point out. Jesus was trying to explain that God is in charge, and God can do what he wants. He can be generous. He can let somebody into heaven with a deathbed confession, even though you've served God your whole life. And honestly, you should rejoice at that and not be jealous, and not sound like, speak like it's unfair, and the concept of the one who is not in charge accusing the one in charge of being unfair is the concept of me setting in judgment over the master. And that's an arrogant thing to do. To sit in judgment over the master is an arrogant thing to do. It's to think that I have better insight, that I have the ability to even distinguish between right and wrong at the level of the master. And so, we talk about fairness a lot in our world. It's something we're obsessed with, and I think that we sort of equate fairness with justice, and I think God, and we do that to justify ourselves in our feelings about fairness. Justice is something that God does care about, but God is the one who determines what is just, and we fight for justice as He sees it. That's what we're called to do, not to sit in judgment over Him and fight for fairness on our behalf. That's a different thing. So one of the struggles with apologetics and trying to have a discussion with somebody who, for instance, is asking about one of the major questions about about God and reasons that many people don't serve God, is the problem of human suffering. So how is it fair? Is the idea that a child dies of cancer or something like that? How is this fair? And the answer is clearly it's not fair. But using that as a tool or a measure to judge the one that's in charge, when he is outside of time and has insight that we don't have, I think is foolish and arrogant. And obviously that's not the best answer for somebody who's really wrestling personally with the problem of human suffering. It's not a well accepted answer for somebody who is using the problem of human suffering as a purely intellectual argument. They're not going to respond to that. But I think it's really the ultimate answer, if we're really being honest, is to believe in and trust in God is at its base to decide that I'm not the one that sits in judgment upon Him. That whether He is fair in my eyes or not doesn't matter, because He is the one who determines what is just and what is right. And that is a base assumption that we have to make if we're going to believe in and trust in God. And somebody who's truly wrestling with that, I think that a decision to come to that base assumption will bring them peace, where wrestling over the question of why and what's fair does not ever bring peace. Somebody that's creating an intellectual argument and will probably never come to that conclusion, because they're not really seeking peace. They're not really seeking God. So that's just a thought. But Jesus was ultimately telling this parable it's a kingdom of heaven is like parables. So he's trying to explain how the kingdom of heaven is different from what goes on the earth. And it's something that I feel like as we get into this text, we're going to find out that the disciples did not fully understand the parable, because they still were not quite grasping the idea of the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Number 2, what happens in 20:17 through 19? Well, the heading in my Bible points out that he is telling his disciples the same thing for a third time. So we can say this, we can explain this a lot of times, a lot of ways. If we believed that the book of Matthew was a pure history, then we would just say, well, Jesus said it 3 times, so Matthew recorded it 3 times. But that's not actually what we believe about the Gospels. We believe that they were written for a purpose, and they are not purely history. They were written to explain something, or to illustrate something, or to sort of prove something, or to advance a way of thinking. The gospel writers are often called evangelists because they are trying to tell about Jesus and who he is. And so they did not record everything in Jesus's life. They would be much longer. John actually comes right out and says that. He says if all the miracles that Jesus performed were recorded, there wouldn't be enough pages here. But these are included so that you will believe. That's what John says. So we know that the gospel writers sort of picked and chose what they were going to include for a specific purpose, and therefore, if the purpose was to tell a truth to somebody, then why do I need to read? I can go back and read this over and over. So I don't need the same text or the same teaching to be repeated 3 times in the same book. I can go back and read that one 3 times. So that's like a waste of room unless there's a point to Matthew including it 3 times. Now I'll say this is the 3rd time he actually records it. The 4th time, 4 times, because it shows up again at the Last Supper. Just in case, I know there are some people that would say, well, the 3 times. It's about the number 3 and its completion. Well, in Matthew, he records this teaching 4 times. B, Jesus predicts his death. Yes, that is the teaching. That is the thing that he's trying to tell his disciples and us. And then C, perhaps the meaning in the passage is as much the number of times or the constant nature of his reminders that the author Matthew inserts it as it is what he is saying. So in other words, that's a complex, confusing sentence. Perhaps the point is the number of times, but maybe not the number of times like 3 or 12 or whatever, but more the fact that he keeps coming back to this. Like, I think Matthew is trying to make a point that Jesus didn't just say this one time, that he actually kept coming back to it. And every time they were headed toward sort of a next step in the journey, Jesus would stop, pull his disciples aside, and say, "This is what's coming." And I would argue that we have this the placement in between this parable that Jesus tells about the first shall be last and the last shall be first, and this mother's request that we're going to talk about next really kind of serves to illustrate for us how far from getting it the disciples seem to have been, despite Jesus continuing to teach it. So finishing up, see, the meaning from him telling his disciples what was going to happen could probably be extracted if we included it only once. How many other teachings are included multiple times in the same gospel? And you can do that as an intellectual exercise if you want, but I don't know of any other that's expressly repeated almost in the same words multiple times in the same gospel. So it seems like that is what Matthew is trying to express more than, we could extract the truth with it being included just once. We could study now again for a 3rd time what Jesus is teaching, or we could say, maybe the point is that he's teaching it a 3rd time. And that they have heard this over and over again, and yet still, based on where it's located in the story, it seems like still they don't understand. And it sets the tone for what Jesus is going to try to teach to these disciples, to all the disciples surrounding this mother's request. So number 3, what happens next according to 2021, 20, 20, and 21? A, the mother of Zebedee's sons, who are James and John, sons of thunder, sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus with her sons, kneeling down, asked a favor of him. And so she was very respectful. She didn't sarcastically say, "Well, if Jesus would just put my kids in charge." She came with them, knelt before him, and say, "Will you grant me what I desire?" And he says, "Well, what is it that you want?" That's B. Jesus asks her what she wants. And C, she asks that her sons sit at Jesus' right and left in his kingdom. So the right and the left of a ruler, these are the closest advisors. We can we understand that. We can picture that. In a king's court, we've seen enough movies, even though we don't have so many kings today, we've seen enough movies to know that whoever's let in the room is pretty important, because not everybody gets access to the king's court, the king's room. Not everybody gets to eat with the king. But the person at the right and the left are the person that can whisper in their ear, the person that are the closest advisors. If somebody else comes into the throne room with a request, not everybody can advise sort of real time and in the moment, but the one at the right and the left can. They can lean in. And therefore, they become the people that are in charge. Enough times people have seen them right there, advising the king, that when they leave the king's presence, they go out. If he's like, "I need something really important done," if he says, I need the floor swept, maybe he's got somebody that he calls in for that, or maybe he speaks to somebody across the room. But if he needs something really important done, he asks the person at his right or his left, and they go out representing him. And so we kind of have an understanding of that. So that's what she's asking. She's asking, this goes back to very much the same "who's the greatest in the kingdom" conversation. That the question always was, who's the one that really represents Jesus when he's the king, when he's in charge? Who's the one that really gets to go out and do the bidding? And when I show up, people know that I represent Jesus, and therefore I have this power and authority. That's really the question that's being asked. It's the question that was being asked, and I know you don't want to talk about the little children or the little ones again, but it's the question that was being asked when Jesus brought they still don't get it. So then he predicts his death. Like he tells them a parable about, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And then he predicts his death, and he says, "Look, it's not the kind of kingdom you think. We're going to Jerusalem and I'm going to die." And they're like, "Yeah, but when you're king, can my sons be at your right and your left?" And I know my mom thinks that's why I'm bald. When I sat and did my homework, I did this. And I think the more I had kids and I oversaw people in the church, the more I just do this, and that just rubs the hair right off my head. And so it's surprising that Jesus's pictures all have him with long flowing hair. I feel like Jesus's pictures should show him like this. After 3 years with the disciples, he had to have rubbed it all off. So this is crazy. This is just really illustrates how much the disciples are not hearing what Jesus is trying to say. And we say, "Oh, well, it's the mom, it's not the disciples. Oh, really? The mom wants what's better. It's all of the above. The disciples, James and John, were with her. So, I mean, let's just picture. Um, it's interesting how it works in families. If you find a family whose mom, thinks that their child should be elevated into positions, then show me a child whose mom thinks they should be elevated into positions who does not come to believe that they deserve those positions themselves. So what I'm telling you is if the mom thought this, it has been passed on to her children. You be careful. And if the children didn't believe this, then when mom said, let's go to Jesus and ask this, they would have said, no, mom, that's not the way it works. That's not how this kingdom is going to be. They would have explained it to her. But it's just as likely that they said to mom, why don't we go ask Jesus? Maybe he'll listen if you ask for us. It's just as likely that that's how it happened than it is that she. But they were all in this together. So it wasn't just the mom; it was the mom and them. And if it started with the mom, then you can be sure it passed on to the values and the desires for position and authority in them. And if it started with them, the mom was all about it, because what mom doesn't want their kid to be in an important position? But I've seen, by the way, don't destroy your kids. You destroy your kids both by prophesying terrible things, speaking terrible things over them in a way that those terrible things come true, as well as by speaking something into their lives about what they deserve that gets them into a situation where they don't respect authority, and they don't, like I've just seen kids that think they deserve every position, but they don't work for anything, and it's no good. Don't destroy your kids. Number 4, how does Jesus respond according to 2022? He says, you don't know what you're asking. And then he says, can you drink the cup I'm going to drink? And how did James and John respond? They said, we can. So this is an interesting thing, because number 5, what did Jesus say next according to 2023? You will indeed. In other words, okay. You can't now, but you will. And then he says, B, but this is not for me to grant. C, this is a decision for the Father. You may be misunderstanding the whole deal. So in other words, if Jesus is in an earthly kingdom, then sitting in his right and left is for him to decide. But if Jesus' kingdom is a spiritual kingdom, and he sits at the right hand of the Father now making intercession for us, which that's what we believe, then, just in case you're confused, his left hand is the Father, because he's at the right hand of the Father. That's how that works. So in other words, it's not his kingdom, it's the Father's kingdom. I mean, it is his kingdom. They're together in this, but it's not his to grant. You're not really understanding what's going on here. As I was sort of writing this and thinking about this, preparing to teach this, I thought of a time when I was on staff. For those of you that don't know, I was on staff at Sandia for 7 years or so. I think a little more than 7 years. I started out as a college and career pastor, and then I moved into an assistant pastor role where I oversee one of our campuses. I had administrative responsibilities in a lot of ways, if you will. Pastor Bain was our pastor, and by the time that he left, Pastor Fred and I were his right and left hand. In fact, he went he went on sabbatical, and we brought in 50 members into the church while he was gone. And he's told me since then that that was when he realized that he could move on, because we brought in 50 members. It was essentially the church. We were leading the church. We didn't. And believe me, so the first time I was assistant pastor and he left, I was advised. In fact, he told me, do the things you think I would do. And I about went nuts trying to get my brain to think like his brain, to do the things that I thought he would do. And I remember, we had weather or something. It was, and there was a decision of whether we should cancel a Wednesday night church or whatever. And I was like racking my brain trying to decide what he would do. By the time a couple years later he went on sabbatical, I decided I can't do the lead like I think he would lead. And I know I'm a little off subject here, but I'm going to get back to it. And so when he left on sabbatical, I decided that Fred and I would lead how we lead, and show him and do what we believed God was telling us to do, and show him what we could do if we did what we felt like God was leading us to do, not what we thought he would do. I mean, ideally those would be the same thing, or at least very similar, but it's a very different way of thinking, and I felt a lot more comfortable in that. And that's also what made him, I think, feel comfortable that we could continue on leading if he wasn't here, because we started leading the way we would lead, not the way we thought he would lead. Within reason, within, if we had headed off track in a way that he didn't think was going to work, that would have been different. But anyway, I remember a time when I was sitting with him, and I don't remember what we were discussing, but I said something like, at that point I had went through periods where I didn't get paid, and I had went through periods where, like, I had sacrificed a lot to go into ministry. I had racked up debt on my credit card, which probably wasn't wise, to give money to the church and to buy turkeys for the church. I remember we were short of turkeys for a Thanksgiving giveaway, and I took a credit card and spent, I don't know, $600 or $700 on turkeys to make sure that we had turkeys for literally the people that were already at our facility, waiting for a turkey, believing they were going to get a turkey. And what do you do? Well, I made sure we had turkeys, and I went out and did that. Nobody asked me to. Pastor Bain was up preaching. He didn't tell me to. I just went and did that. And so I felt like at that point in my life, I was at a place where I would do what needed to be done for the ministry to go forward in the church. For those of you that are in our church, particularly our staff, it's a big difference. It's a big difference between a staff member that encounters a problem and calls me and asks me what we're going to do. So that problem is on me, and a staff member that decides to fix the problem and then lets me know after the fact what was done to fix the problem. And so that's somebody that takes responsibility, that doesn't just turn to me. So that's somebody that's ready to be in charge, essentially, because the problem with being in charge is there's nobody to call. And there are a lot of leaders, especially in pastoral ministry, I think, that are quick to call the district superintendent or somebody else and just shirk responsibility. And if things don't work out, they'll just resign. It's not really their problem. And I don't think that's a good way to lead. I think at some point we need to say, God's put me in this position of responsibility. It's my responsibility. I need his help. I can't do it on my own, but I'm going to make sure things get taken care of, and I don't have to call anybody else to make sure it's done. Anyway, so I was at that position in my life and in my commitment to God and the commitment to our particular church. And I remember we were having a discussion, and I said, "Well, I've given everything, kind of like the disciples did in the last, chapter. We've left everything to follow you." And I remember Pastor Bain looking at me and saying, "Don't think you care about this church more than I do." And I was upset. I don't know. I wasn't inside his head. I'm still not inside his head. We haven't had a discussion about what he meant by that or whatever. But I think now, 15 years into leading our church, I think I know. I think I understand what he was saying. He had given a lot more than I had at that point to keep this church going, to continue the ministry that we were doing. He had been attacked. He had done a lot. And he didn't ask the question, but I see in what he was saying to me the question, can you drink the cup that I'm drinking? And my answer inherently was, yeah, I can, like these disciples. And he didn't say this. I mean, we it kind of ended. I was so upset it ended the conversation, so we didn't get to talk about it anymore. But I think the real answer that I would give me if I was sitting in his seat now, which I kind of am, is you will. You will. But in the end, that's not the point. And he went on and said, you know, it's not mine to give or whatever. Um, I would say to whoever becomes the pastor after me, I don't think I'll be so offensive as to say, do you think you care about this church more than me? But uh, I've felt that before when people have looked at me and said they've done this or they've done that. I'm like, don't think you care about this more than me. But I watch as people start to take the hits and as people start to take care of things before it ever gets to me. And I start to see people that might be willing to drink from that cup someday. And I can't say that brings me joy. I think it's mixed responses. It makes me happy that somebody thinks this is worth dying for, not just our local church, but the kingdom, the people of God, the people that we're reaching is worth dying for, is worth giving everything for. Um, but it's not fun. So I was talking to Pastor Bain, my mentor, still, and they have just installed a new. So he's been over the church planning and evangelism, director of evangelism and church planning, and they have just installed a person who is now the director of church planning. So she's kind of on his staff, but I think at some point the plan is perhaps for them to be there to be two positions there and sort of co-equal. Um, but nonetheless, you know, she has been very successful in church planning, and people from the outside have thought a lot of things. But he was saying that they were discussing how much she gave, like sort of herself, how much she sacrificed to make the church that she and others planted um, go. And it always looks different from the outside. There's always somebody that's really giving their life for that. So now, I know all of this maybe sounds a little self-centered in the way that I'm talking about this, and who's Jesus in the story, and am I identifying with Jesus? Honestly, in some ways, maybe, but in other ways, I'm identifying with these foolish disciples and their mom. But I would say, as we go on here, that Jesus is trying to present for them what it looks like to follow him in his kingdom. And I would say that the story I was trying to tell shows me being like James and John. And then at some point in my ministry, understanding better what it really meant to be the leader of our church, which is what Jesus is trying to explain. So now I'm going to get now we're transitioning. Believe it or not, we actually came to right where I wanted to come to, and we're going to. So number 6 says, how, according to 2024, did the other 10 disciples respond? A, they were fine with it. Everybody knew that James and John were kind of the best anyway. That's not true. That's funny. It's funny how differently we think of ourselves versus how other people think of us. So, B, they were indignant. The other disciples were indignant that these two thought that they should be at his right and left and thought that they were better than everybody else. See, well, apparently the way their mom thought of them was a little different from how their friends thought of them, and that's true. So then, number 7, what did Jesus do in response to this situation? A, Jesus called them together. Okay, we're going to address this. We're going to talk about this. There's obviously some division here. There's obviously some people feeling some kind of way. So he called them together. B, Jesus acknowledged that the rulers in this world lord their power and authority over others. And then C, Jesus says that is not that this should not be so with the leaders in God's kingdom. So that's what we were getting to, is I came in like James and John, and then at some point realized, I think, what Pastor Bain, I think, was trying to express to me, and that is that to really lead was about not drawing lines about how far I will go in terms of what I will give for those that I serve. D, Jesus says that whoever wants to be great should become a servant of others. Didn't we just have a parable about this? The first shall be last, the last shall be first. Stop worrying about what we get and start thinking about what we're willing to give up and what we're not willing to give up, which may be more important of a thought in order to really lead in the kingdom of God. E, Jesus pointed out how he lives and dies should be an example for them. So he says, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So this is what it looks like to lead. To be willing to give your own life, to be willing to sacrifice yourself. And that's what I believe that Pastor Bain was talking to me about that day. I believe that I felt like I was willing to give, like I'd already given a lot, but I hadn't given even a fraction of what he had given over those 14 years that he served our church. And I think he was like, I don't think you've gone as far as you are going to have to go in order to be the leader. And now, looking back on my 15 years serving this church, and also the time serving God and his kingdom, which is maybe more important, I understand better that back then I hadn't even begun to understand what it took. So I had been on staff 7 years at that point. Now I've been the lead pastor 15 years for a total of 22 years. And I would say 7 years in, before I had been the lead pastor, I didn't understand even close of what I was going to have to sacrifice to lead God's people at Sandia. Um, and I think that's what he's trying to tell his disciples is the person that is going to lead, have power, have authority, needs to be willing to serve everybody, even at great cost. And they were worried about power and authority, and he was asking, "Are you? I don't think you're ready to give what it takes to be a leader in the kingdom of God." In society, people get a position and they lord it over people. That's not the way it is in the kingdom of God. You get a position and you serve. That's different. It's really different. Um, because you're willing to serve people that are doing things wrong. You're willing to give your life for somebody that's not doing enough that you think is wrong. It's different. Anyway, I'm becoming very reflective in this Bible study because I'm trying to express how I'm not sure. We can beat up the disciples about this, but I'm not sure we're anywhere close to even understanding it as well as the disciples did. Um, so consider what are you willing to do for others in the kingdom of God.